Hello and welcome to the Lancaster Patriot Podcast. My name is Chris Hume. I hope you had a very Merry Christmas, and I'm glad to be back and glad that you are joining me once again for this episode. And this episode of the Lancaster Patriot Podcast is brought to you by Nickel Mine Floor Covering. They offer sales and installation of quality carpet, ceramic tiles, hardwood floors, laminate floors, whatever you need for your floors. Nickel Mine Floor Covering has got you covered. So go to nickelminefloorcovering.com, or you can go in person to their showroom in Corryville, Pennsylvania. Again, nickelminefloorcovering.com for all your flooring needs. So thanks to Nickel Mine Floor Covering for sponsoring this episode. Well, Charles Spurgeon once said that discernment is not the ability to tell the difference between right and wrong. Rather, it is telling the difference between right and almost right. And I want to apply that maxim, if you will, to today, especially as it relates to civil government, as it relates to resisting tyrants, as it relates to looking back on 2020 and looking ahead for what might come next for the Church of Jesus Christ. And to do that, I want to interact with a podcast put out by the Sword and the Trowel podcast, an episode they did recently. And the episode was about a man's book, and the man is Timothy Decker, and his book is called A Revolutionary Reading of Romans 13. And here's the subtitle: A Biblical Case for Lawful Subjection to the Civil Magistrate and Dutiful Resistance to Tyrants. Now, I want to interact briefly with some clips from this podcast because one of my concerns with what is happening now within Reformed churches, within evangelical churches, is that men who previously would have written off theonomy, would have considered those of us who were seeking to apply the law word of God to the civil sphere, who were trying to resist tyrants in America, in our day, those men who in the past either dismissed that, ignored that, wrote it off, now they're coming around to say, you know what, we were not prepared for 2020. We need to think really clearly, and we need to think biblically about what is the role of civil government, what is the role of church. Those men who would have written off the theonomists are now coming to say, you know what, we need to think about how God's law applies in the civil sphere. And yet I'm concerned that they're not going far enough. And this is the Spurgeon quote thing. They're almost right, but they're not there. And I think I'm going to explain why that is a concern to me, especially as it relates to how they are thinking back to 2020 and pre-2020, and why they were in the position they were, that now they say, you know what, we weren't prepared. And so I want to talk about this. I think this is important as we move forward and say, okay, what's the next threat to the church? And there's some application I want to make here. So to start this off, let me play this clip. This is a clip from the Sword and the Trowel podcast where you have Tom Ascol and Graham Gunden, and they're sort of interviewing Timothy Decker. And Timothy Decker is the author of this forthcoming book. The book has not come out yet, so obviously I have not read it. But to introduce this, I want to play a few minutes of this podcast just to set the stage of what these men are talking about. So this is going to be, Timothy Decker is going to be responding to, I think Tom Ascol is going to ask him first about why he wrote this book. So listen to this clip.
Well, we are delighted today to welcome from outside of Roanoke, Virginia, Timothy Decker. Timothy, thank you for joining the Sword and Trowel today.
It's a pleasure to be on the Sword and the Trowel.
Yeah, Timothy is a pastor there. He's also an instructor, professor for Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary, for the IRBS Seminary, and most significantly for us today, he has written a forthcoming book from Founders Press called The Revolutionary Reading of Romans 13. And that's a significant book. Of course, Romans 13 is a significant chapter, been much in the news over the last few years. Be interesting to do a little Google analysis and see how much Romans 13 has been Googled over the last couple of years versus the 20 years prior or so. I'm sure there's a spike.
Yeah.
So, Timothy, thank you for joining us, and thanks for writing this book, man. What was the genesis of this book? I remember some of our early emails back and forth, but tell us, what was it that put a burr under your saddle to get a book like this out?
Well, there's so many ways to answer that, I think. This book was largely what I wish I had known and studied before 2020. How I wish as a pastor I would have led our church prior to 2020. One of God's good providences of all of that happened in that year and subsequent years was it taught us a lot of our deficiencies in our training, our biblical understanding and knowledge. And so the genesis really became, at some point we started realizing there's no way that this is the shutdowns and mask mandates and so forth can be legitimized. And so we had to, we started to slowly push back, not as quickly as I would have liked to have been able to say, but we had some in our church ask us, are we doing right by Romans 13? And that was the text specifically. And so between myself and my co-pastor, it landed on me to preach on Romans 13. And as I was studying it, I came to realize, wow, was I woefully inadequate in my preparation. And so I spent a lot of time studying and researching. It turned out to be probably the longest sermon I've ever preached, much to the demise of my dear folks.
All right, so that was Timothy Decker, and I do want to give him kudos and credit where credit is due. I mean, he is admitting that he was woefully unprepared for 2020. And I think that's an important admission to make. Again, and this goes back to the Spurgeon quote. He's almost there. I mean, that's a step in a good direction. That's a step in the right direction. To say, you know what, 2020 came, we were not prepared for this. Now, the question that I really want to ask on this episode is, why were you not prepared for this, Timothy Decker? And also Graham Gunden, he's going to have some comments here that I really want to drive the point home. Why were you not prepared for this? Because here's one of my main points. If we don't know why we were not prepared for 2020, we are likely going to be ill-prepared for something else down the road. So it's not enough for men like Timothy Decker, John MacArthur. You know, they shut down their church, and I did a whole episode on John MacArthur. I refer you to that. But it's not enough for us to be like, okay, we were wrong. And MacArthur won't even say that. I mean, I've never heard MacArthur say that he was wrong. So Timothy Decker, I give him credit for saying, you know what, I was wrong. However, and I might not get a chance to play this later, so I'll say it now. I have a clip of Decker in that podcast. Listen to the whole thing, the Sword and the Trowel podcast, where Decker says, you know what, I had to ask forgiveness for staying closed longer than was proper. So again, he's so close, he's almost right, but he's not right. You should have asked forgiveness for closing at all. And I'm trying to avoid those arguments. I've made those in the John MacArthur episode, the episode I did on Dr. Chris Walker on why he shut down the Assembly of the Saints. You can check out my book, Scattering the Sheep. I'll link that stuff in the description here because I don't want to rehash all those arguments about why the pastor should not turn away his sheep, why he should always be available to meet with his sheep. But that's just another example where, man, this is almost right. This is encouraging, right? Like you are coming to admit that you weren't prepared for 2020, you made wrong choices, and you're humble enough to admit that. But it still leaves something to be desired when you're apologizing for staying closed longer than you should have. And again, I refer you to the episodes I did on that, and we might be able to come back to that. Okay, so Decker is saying, look, I wasn't prepared for this. I was not prepared for 2020. The question I want to ask again is why weren't you prepared? And why was it that so many Reformed pastors were not prepared for 2020? And why is it that many were and never shut down? And why is it that for them, this was not some crazy thing that they hadn't thought about before? That's what I want to talk about today. That's what this episode is about. I think this is very important because I'm seeing more and more of this sort of rhetoric. And this episode with Timothy Decker is an example of that, where you have men who are coming out now and saying, you know what, we were wrong. We didn't get it right. Now we're putting forth our understanding of Romans 13, and now I think we'll be prepared. I think it leaves something to be desired, and I'll try to explain why. As I already mentioned about closing the Assembly of the Saints, there's two kind of main parts to this that relates to this. One is Romans 13 and the limits of government, and two is whether or not the pastor should shut down the Assembly of the Saints. They're related, but they are distinct because you could have the correct view of Romans 13 and the limits that God places on the civil government and still have an incorrect view of your role as a pastor and then shut down the Assembly of the Saints and say, kind of like Dr. Walker did when he said, the government's not requiring us to do this, but as the pastor, I am requiring it, and my sheep are not allowed to gather with their shepherd. So both of these things need to come together, and this is, again, sort of part of the almost right thing. Okay, if these men come to say, you know what, Romans 13, we misunderstood it, we misapplied it, the government doesn't have carte blanche, but we as pastors still have the authority to cancel the assembly of the saints. We're still not there. We're still not where we need to be yet. But that isn't the main thing I want to focus on in this episode. I want to focus on the reason why people like Graham Gunden, who I'll play a clip from him in a moment, he's there on that podcast, would say things like, you know what? We weren't prepared for this, and no one was prepared for it. Essentially, that seems to be what he says, and I'm going to play that clip in just a moment here. And I want you to listen to what he says, and then I want us to ask, and I'm going to talk about this, is he correct when he says that no one was prepared for 2020, there wasn't anyone thinking about these sorts of things prior to 2020? Now, if Graham Gunden is correct about that, then that we could deal with that. If he's incorrect, then we have to deal with why someone like Graham Gunden believes something that is not true, and what are the implications of that false belief. So here's a clip from Gunden saying that prior to 2020, there wasn't anyone thinking about resisting tyrants in any practical manner. Listen to what Gunden says.
That though I called this a revolutionary reading of Romans 13, it doesn't mean that it's a new reading.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm implying by the term revolutionary, but rather the content of Romans 13 has to do with private revolution. And I just kept repeating what many have said for centuries before me.
Now, I'd be interested for you to kind of maybe give us a snapshot of the argument, the last clause of that subtitle, the duty of disobeying tyrants. I mean, when is that legitimate? I mean, biblically from Romans 13, because before 2020, this was not something that anyone ever talked about, unless you were talking about theoreticals in the American Revolution and that kind of stuff. But as if this could ever happen in our lifetime, as if this would ever be necessary in our lifetime.
That's right. Russia, China, Cuba.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are the principles there that people can be looking for as they read the book?
All right, we need to camp there for quite a bit. I mean, that was a pretty, to me, shocking statement from Graham Gunden, where he said there wasn't no one ever talked about resisting tyrants other than in some ivory tower scholarly debate about the American War for Independence. No one talked about this. That's what he's saying. Now, so I want to build up to this, and this is where I want us to unpack this episode. Again, it's not enough to look back at 2020 and for pastors like Tom Ascol, Graham Gunden, Timothy Decker to be like, whoops, we didn't do what we could have. We didn't know all that we could have known, and if the same thing happens again, well, now we'll be prepared. That's not sufficient, because that's just saying, okay, we learned from this horrible situation of government tyranny. We learned this one little thing, but we haven't learned why we were in the position we were to not know that. And that's how this is being presented as I read it. It's like, we had this blind spot that no one was talking about, and 2020 came and we were just blindsided. And you hear this over and over and over. We know nobody had the information at the time. Nobody knew what to do. That's just not true. And even Tom Ascol will say it here and stuff like, we thought for hours and hours and hours what to do. And Tom Ascol shut down his church, at least for 1 week, shut it down. And I'm not even going to read all those quotes, but I do have one where Tom Ascol said, in order to be as careful as we can be, the elders have decided to monitor the situation day by day and to wait until next week to decide about what to do on Sunday, March 29th. So they had already closed for the first week. He's saying, we're not sure about the second week. I'm not sure what he ended up doing. But again, that mindset, to be as careful as we can be. I talked about that a lot on the Chris Walker episode. So it's not enough for it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient. We should not accept as, okay, well, that's reasonable. We can move on to be like, oh, we just had a blind spot there, and now we're good. We need to be asking, and these men need to be asking, why did you have a blind spot? And is it true what Graham Gunden says, that no one was talking about this? So the people that were not prepared for 2020 were not prepared because they had not been thinking biblically about the role of civil government and the application of God's law word to the civil sphere. That's what I believe. I believe that was revealed very clearly. You see, they were not thinking through these things. They were not thinking about, hey, when should Christians disobey man-made laws in favor of God's law word? What they were not thinking about, how does the law of God apply to the civil sphere? What authority does the civil magistrate have? Now, these were the things that theonomists and others perhaps have been thinking through and talking about for decades and decades. But if you listen to some of these men talk, kind of like Graham Gunden here, and even Dr. Bob Godfrey, we did an episode several back on Bob Godfrey, and the way he says things like, well, we might have to start thinking about what sins should be crimes and so forth. And the way Gunden says, there wasn't anyone ever talking about resisting tyrants in any practical way. If you were to hear that and not know, and I'm not even talking about, American history hundreds of years ago, I'm just saying the last 20, 30 years that you lived through, to listen to those men, it would be as if this stuff never happened prior to 2020. And that should be very concerning to us. And that is my concern in this episode. That these men were, and I guess in Gunden's case, still are woefully ignorant of what their Christian brothers and sisters in this nation have been talking about, and not just talking about, but applying for decades and decades. So when Graham Gunden says, there was not anyone, there was no one ever talking about resisting tyrants prior to 2020 in any practical manner, I'm left scratching my head. And Decker seems to say something different. I'm not going to play the clips. Decker does say, you know what, this stuff has been thought about before. And he even references Matt Truella, who has been fighting abortion, and many other hundreds and thousands of men and women have been opposing tyrants in this nation within the past 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So Decker does not say the same thing Gunden does. My concerns for Decker are a little bit different, but they're within the same vein, that you have to take this all the way. You got to be consistent with how you limit the civil government. And we'll touch on that briefly at the end. But to Gunden's point, and it seems like Tom Ascol there sort of agrees with Gunden. He's like, yeah, people weren't thinking about this. It was just some theoretical thing, like maybe, China and North Korea, that's where the tyrants are. And when I hear that, and I know there's probably hundreds and thousands like me, I'm not special here. When I hear that, I'm just like, wow, these men really thought that and still think that prior to 2020, this wasn't a reality in the life of Christians. And that to me is very, very concerning. Because if you're like me, you've been aware of this and opposing tyrants in many different practical ways for years. So let me just start there before talking about me. It doesn't really matter what I think or do. There's hundreds who have been doing this long before me. And it's just very troubling that people like Gunden and even apparently Tom Ascol, because what would have been nice if Tom Ascol, the older gentleman there would have been like, well, no, Mr. Gunden, Pastor Gunden, you're actually wrong. There were many, many Christians thinking about this stuff, and many of them were theonomists and are theonomists, and we sort of kind of wrote them off, and we're kind of like, well, that position is bogus. And we sort of kind of ignored all the practical application that they had, because they were actually talking about these exact things. They were actually talking about what is the role of the civil government? What do they have authority to punish? They were talking about those very things, and we actually kind of dismissed them. So maybe we should take stock and say, you know what? We need to go back and maybe, you don't need to ask forgiveness, but be like, you know what? We were wrong about this stuff. You guys were right. Can you teach us some things? We might not agree with everything you're saying, but you guys got this right. And we didn't. And that's not what Tom Ascol said. Again, the closest that comes to that is Timothy Decker, where he does say men like Matt Truella, and he goes way back to John Knox, Samuel Rutherford. He said people were talking about this. And of course, he's right. I would just like to see Decker take his stance on Romans 13 to its consistent conclusion, which I would argue is a theonomic conclusion, at least what I would argue for, that the civil government does not have authority to do anything beyond which God has instituted in his word. So, but let me just go back to the 1970s here, okay? And I want to just briefly share two quotes one from Bonson, one from Rushdoony, just to show again, the idea, first of all, with the revolutionary reading. Timothy Decker says this is not a new reading. It's simply the idea that in Romans 13, Paul is speaking against the Jewish Christians who were prone to violent revolt to overthrow Rome. And he says if we're going to understand Romans 13, we need to understand that it's a charge against violent revolution. It's not a charge to submit blithely to every civil government mandate. Again, Decker's not claiming that's new. I just want to affirm that and read quotes here from Greg Bahnsen and Rushdoony, two well-known theonomists, both dead now. And this was written in the 1970s. And Bahnsen said, it is quite clear that Romans 13 has two elements in it, practical ethics and normative description. When both are not respected, then the church ends up either with the distortion that the practical command to be subject means that normative authority is granted to anything the state might do with minor qualifications, or with the distortion that the normative role of the state laid out by Paul must override the duty to be submissive and grant the right to violent revolution. All right, so Bahnsen in 1977 is discussing the very thing that Decker is now, namely Romans 13 does teach, do not turn to violent revolution, but it also teaches, hey, this does not teach unlimited submission to the state and whatever they decree. Rushdoony again said something similar about revolution. He said, but the key to remedying the situation is not revolution, nor any kind of resistance that works to subvert law and order. Okay, just both Bahnsen and Rushdoony there, just briefly on the issue of revolution. That's sort of Timothy Decker's, the main foundation of his book, where he comes to say, hey, there's been people quoting Romans 13. This is at least what I understand his book is going to be based on the sermon I listened to and that podcast. Timothy Decker says, hey, some Christians have been claiming that Romans 13 means we have to submit to the state no matter what, obey them no matter what, whatever they say we do. And Timothy Decker's like, I don't think that's right. And I think we need to understand that Paul is here speaking about violent revolution, that we should not be violent, revolutionaries or insurrectionists. But Paul is not teaching that the civil government can do whatever it wants. And I would agree with that. And I would say that the theonomists have been preaching that for years and years and years. And to be fair, Decker at least does acknowledge Matt Truella, Samuel Rutherford, John Knox. But there are many, many more in our own day who are talking about these things. And not just talking about them, but living them out. So, again, Matt Truella was mentioned by Decker. If Gunden was familiar with Matt Truella, and not just Matt Truella, but the hundreds of people who have been involved in the abolition movement, in ending abortion, they've dealt with these very issues in terms of tyrants in our day. And people that have been involved in that sort of thing, it would just be so strange to them to hear Gunden say, yeah, prior to 2020, there wasn't anyone ever talking about resisting tyrants in America. It was just this theoretical thing from the 1700s. And it's just, wow, like you are really that ignorant of what was going on in your own nation for the last 10, 20, 30 years? And maybe you were, but then to me, it would be, okay, at this point, at 2020, hopefully you'd be like, oh, wait a minute, let me go back and look, and let me listen to some of my brothers and sisters who were saying we were prepared for this, and let me correct myself and say, it would have been better if Gunden said, I thought prior to 2020, I was in such a bubble, I was living under such a pietistic rock, I was in my theological bubble that I actually believed that no one was talking about resisting tyrants practically in America. I actually believed that, and I was wrong. And now I realize there were hundreds and thousands of Christians doing that, and many of the theonomic works and books and articles and sermons were addressing this very thing. And man, was I blinded. And why was I blind? And that's what I need to figure out. But that's not what Gunden's saying, at least at this point. He's saying, you know what? He still believes that prior to 2020, people weren't thinking about this. And that is a concern. Why is it that men like Gunden and perhaps even Tom Ascol were so ill-prepared and perhaps completely ignorant of men like Matt Truella, like Greg Bahnsen? See, I think they knew who these guys were, but again, now this is me, a bit of being a speculation here. And again, this goes off of the Dr. Godfrey talks. It just seems to me, it's like, yeah, we know the theonomic position. We've debunked it, and we're not going to spend much time thinking about it. And if you're like me, who I would say 2011, 2012, I started to really get into an understanding of what is the role of the civil government biblically. And I know many people have the same experience as me. When you start to talk to people about that, they dismiss it and write it off and say, oh, you're one of those theonomists, and didn't Godfrey and those Westminster guys debunk that view? And you want a state church and all these things? And it's like, well, no, I just want to talk about what the civil government has authority to do, because I'm seeing them issuing a lot of mandates that I don't see them having authority in the Bible to issue. And people were like, we'll dismiss that. We know about that position. We're not interested in thinking about it more. That's been my experience. And if it's been mine, I'm sure it's been many others. And this confirms it, this sort of ignorance. And I'm not saying that to be disrespectful. It's literally ignorance. He says that prior to 2020, there wasn't anyone talking about this stuff, and that is just completely false. And so Gunden's either ignorant or he's lying, and I don't want to say he's lying. I don't have any evidence to say that, but it's one of the two. He's either ignorant of this stuff or he knows it's true, and he's saying that he didn't believe it. I think to be more gracious to him, we'll say he's ignorant of this. He did not know and does not know all the work that had been done prior to 2020 on resisting tyrants. So the real concern for us should not simply be, those pastors and Bible teachers were missing just a tiny bit of their theology as it concerns Romans 13, and now they've patched that up, and we're good to go. Whatever comes at us next, we're good to go. I don't think that's how we should be thinking about it. The concern we should have, and the questions that if I could ask Pastor Gunden and others, it would be, what culture that you were part of, that you fostered, that you helped create, and was maintained by men like you and others, that led to an environment where someone like you, Graham Gunden, would have no clue about all the work, both scholarly and practical, that Christians have been engaged in for the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, I'm relatively new to this. I mean, it had only been about 10 years prior to 2020 that I really started to think about the role of civil government from a biblical perspective. But there are others, like Pastor Joel Sain, who often comes on this podcast, who've been thinking about that for far longer than I have. And of course, Matt Truella as well, and many others. And so, Christians have been engaged in this work for a long time. And the fact that people like Gunden are like, this hasn't been, I'm just hearing it over and over again. That's a big problem. It reveals a big problem with the culture that has been created within Reformed Christianity by men like this. And it's not just Baptists or it's Paedo Baptist, Credo Baptist. It's across the board. You have Dr. Godfrey who's saying something similar where he's like, well, now we're going to have to start thinking about, what crimes, what sins should be crimes. And we have Graham Gunden here saying, no one was thinking about this prior to 2020. So it's across the board in the Reformed world, and it's a big problem. And if someone like me, just an ordinary guy, can see that, oh man, we've been fighting this fight, we've been trying to for a while. I know there are hundreds and thousands of Christians like me over the past 50 plus years who have been opposing tyranny, tyranny and tyrannical mandates that have come out long before 2020 under the auspices of democracy and man-made law. So there's so much there. What I found is that the theonomic position is one that really takes seriously the role of civil government. And again, I want to give credit where credit's due, and I want to be encouraged where I should be encouraged. It seems like maybe, people like Timothy Decker are saying, all right, we got to start moving in that direction. We need to have a biblically based worldview as it relates to the civil magistrate. Now, if they did before, then I think he's honest at least and be like, I didn't have that. I mean, I was so ill-prepared. And I do appreciate that at least about Timothy Decker. But for decades and decades prior to 2020, the theonomists were largely dismissed or supposedly refuted, right? I mean, there are books that come out and said, we've refuted the theonomic position. Well, if you did, and I don't think you did, but if you did, you should have put forth a biblical position for the civil magistrate and what their authority is and what their authority is not. And generally speaking, you didn't do that. Now, maybe someone might say, oh, yeah, well, Wayne Grudem did it over here or whatever, and, or Vern Poythress. Well, I know there's stuff that's been written, but I'm focusing on comments like this by Graham Gunden, who said, in his mind, that was all theoretical. None of it was practical. And that's troubling. So, I mean, I remember back in 2014, it was the summer of 2014, I was living in Delaware at the time. And again, my example is not unique. I mean, I was just a nobody who was made aware, as I continue to study the Bible, hey, wait a minute, the civil government can't do whatever they want. Do they get carte blanche to sin? And so I began reading some of the works of theonomists, and I continued to study the Bible. And I said, wait a minute, there are government tyrants out there who are issuing decrees to punish the righteous. And so in 2014, I remember going before, this was in Delaware, the state capitol in Dover, going before the representatives or the state senators, whoever they were. And there was, at the time, abortion, and it still is, I believe, abortion was legal in Delaware. And I would often go to the abortion mill and share the gospel and protest the butchery of babies there. So abortion was legal in the state of Delaware. And again, I believe it still is. And at the time in 2014, there were so many laws around midwifery that the midwife who delivered, I think it was 2 or 3 of our kids, I think 3, but at the time it was maybe 1 or 2. The midwife who helped deliver our babies was essentially breaking the law. And I think it may have been a felon. Don't quote me on that, but she was breaking the law because the government had made so many regulations that it was effectively very difficult for anyone to get a midwife license. And so she was breaking the law by helping mothers deliver their babies and treasuring life. And yet the abortionist down the road was not breaking the law when he ripped a baby limb from limb. And so people, and I'm not the only one. I mean, there's, people have been doing this far longer and with far greater success than I have. But I just remember 2014 going in there, and I even posted some stuff, and there's a video, you can find it, of me talking about this. And I was not very polished, and I'm probably still not, but calling on the state reps to say, look, you are acting outside of your God-ordained role and authority. You do not have the authority to punish righteous actions. And a midwife delivering a baby is a righteous thing. It's a good thing. You have no authority to punish that. You are a tyrant. And so I guess Graham Gunden is completely ignorant of all these things that have been happening in America. And that to me is a huge concern. And maybe he'd take back his statement, but he's not the only one saying things like this. This is the ascent that I'm hearing at different places. Well, yeah, we weren't thinking about this prior to 2020. Nobody thought about it. And you even hear, Tom Ascol, I think I played that clip where he's like, yeah, but Romans 13, now it's searched at a higher frequency. And that's probably true. But again, it's this mindset that, people just weren't thinking about this. And if that's how we're thinking about this, I just don't think we've really learned that much, because we need to learn why were there Christians that were talking about this, that were opposing tyrants? Why were they sort of dismissed? And why is it now that people like Graham Gunden still think they didn't exist? To me, that is very concerning. If we're going to have growth, as a church across the board, across the nation, like, we have to say, hey, here's why we were ill-prepared for this, not just because we had just a misinterpretation of one verse, but we dismissed an entire, I hate to call it a movement, but an entire group of Christians who were thinking about these very things. And many of them, me included, when COVID happened, were like, no, don't shut down. No, we know how to handle this. We know the government is wicked. I mean, we've been out there protesting. We've been out there calling in person in the state capitals across this nation. There's been many Christians doing that. We've been out there calling on civil government, calling on civil magistrates to repent of their tyranny of punishing the righteous and protecting the evil, or praising the evil. We've been doing this prior to 2020. So this is, we're not surprised by 2020. Here comes something, and the government's going to use it for their nefarious ends. And we should already have a framework that the civil government doesn't control when the church meets. We should already have a framework that the pastor gathers with his sheep. And 2020 was not that complicated. You hear Ascol in this clip is like, hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of thinking and praying about what to do. And it was so difficult. And I'm not trying to be facetious, but it really wasn't that difficult if you had been thinking about this stuff prior. Now, Gunden says no one was. That's simply false. So Gunden is either ignorant or he's lying there. And I hope he's ignorant, because I'm not accusing him of lying, but obviously what he's saying is false, completely false. There's no question about that. Just one more thing that I wrote back in 2014. And again, if someone like me was writing this, and I didn't just come up with this out of the blue, just like Decker says, you know what? This stuff has been being written for years. So I wrote this in 2014. Laws that criminalize good conduct seem to be the specialty of American jurisprudence these days. The church in America has largely abandoned the relevance and validity of God's law word for the civil government. We and our fathers have sown the seeds of humanistic Enlightenment thinking, baptized in the name of Christianity, and now, my friends, we are reaping the whirlwind. When will this nation wake up and say, hey, natural law isn't working out so well for us in this nation? Maybe it will be when we start getting arrested for helping the poor. Maybe it will be when we start getting arrested for preaching the gospel. Maybe then we will realize we are to bring all things under the crown rights of the king. The church has been lulled into complacency. We can think, we have such great blessings here. We have religious freedom. Let's not cause too much trouble, lest we lose the freedoms we have. What? Bow the knee to Caesar in the name of our little pocket of obedience to Christ? What? Hunker down in our little Christian ghettos in order to retain a semblance of freedom while our nation is being destroyed? We can think, let's not rock the boat too much. We should be thankful for what we have. We can worship freely, at least. So, my question is, if these men do not understand why they could be so blind to what was happening around them prior to 2020, that someone like me in the tiny little state of Delaware, seeing tyrants around me, punishing the righteous and praising the wicked, and there are hundreds and hundreds, and many of the listeners to this podcast, and I think there is a strength to the theonomic position, and many of the men and women who thought through these things prior to 2020 were opposing tyrants, and 2020 was not something qualitatively different. Maybe it was quantitatively different. We had more wicked decrees, but it was not qualitatively different, and we knew how to respond to it because we had a framework. And men like Gunden and apparently Pastor Tom Ascol didn't. And my concern now is that they still don't have that framework developed where it needs to be. And I think I should say the same for me. I want to develop my biblical thinking even more. But what I would hope is that men like Gunden and Pastor Tom Ascol would be willing to say, you know what? No one here has it perfect on this earth. We're all learning. But those theonomists over there, at least the ones that were consistent and applied what they thought and didn't shut down and had been talking for decades and decades about resisting tyrants, you know what? Maybe we have something to learn from them. And maybe we should have more of a dialogue and discussion and not simply write them off as, these state church establishmentarianism people, whatever the best way to say that is, establishmentarians, and not just write them off, which is generally the treatment that theonomists often get. And that's one of the things on this podcast. We invite people in, and I, again, extend the invitation. If you're someone like Graham Gunden or Tom Ascol, maybe local here, who's like, you know what? No one's been thinking about this prior, and come in and talk about this so we can have a discussion. There's a not just a minor blind spot. I guess that's what I want to say. It's not just a minor blind spot within Reformed Christianity where, we just missed this little Romans 13 verse 5 or whatever. No, there's a major blind spot, and it's perhaps a willful blind spot that we do not want to really engage with the theonomists. So I think we'll stop there. I have a bunch of other clips. I'll just say a couple things briefly. I won't play them, but in that podcast, I'll link to it. You can watch the whole thing with Tom Ascol, Graham Gunden, and Timothy Decker. Ascol and Decker, and they seem to come around to be like, look, the government doesn't have unlimited authority. They only have a very limited authority. And my plea to them, and this is what the theonomists have been arguing long before I was born, my plea to them would be, okay, yes, take that to its conclusion. It's not good enough to be almost right on this. You want to be right. If the Bible, and I believe it certainly does, limits the civil government in what it can punish, and that's sort of their argument. They're like, the government doesn't have authority here. You're right. Now tell us what the government does have authority to do. And then all those things that it doesn't have authority to do, stand with us in opposing the tyranny. Again, I mentioned the midwife thing. I think the first thing in my life that got me thinking about this was the issue of raw milk, where the civil government, again, at the time in the state I was in or moving to, Delaware, made it illegal to sell raw milk. So there was a mandate from the government And, to some people, who cares? That's not a big deal. But for other people, that's really important. And you're thinking through it. Hey, does the government have the right to control what kind of substances I buy to eat, and to feed my family with? And I don't know, for someone like Gunden, maybe he just never came across any sort of wicked decree like that. I mean, I find that hard to believe, but there were people that were opposing it. And, we have been thinking for a long time about, hey, the government doesn't have authority to do this. And so another of my concern is that people like Tom Ascol, Timothy Decker, Graham Gunden, not sure where he's at now, will be like, hey, you know what? The Bible doesn't give the government the authority to shut down the church. But they're still going to leave untouched everything else the government does. Forced taxation, regulating food, regulating businesses, requiring you to get a driver's license, punishing you for not paying your property tax. Where does the Bible give them authority to do those things? Now, these are the issues that theonomists have been working through for a long time. And I would like these men to be consistent and say, okay, let's take this to its conclusion and let's discuss with the theonomists, because they've been thinking about this for a long time. And many of them were right about this. But we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that sort of, I'd say, repentance and humility. We're seeing a sort of like damage control. Hey, it's pretty hard now to say we made the right choice. So we're going to say, you know what, we learned a few things, and now we've come up with a better position. Again, credit to Decker for saying he's not coming up with anything new. I just pray that he takes this to its conclusion and we can have more serious discussions on this. Again, Decker says in the podcast that the Romans 13, the role of the civil government is to punish evildoers. Amen. Take it all the way, Pastor Decker. That means the civil government should not punish me for righteous actions. Just like it's righteous for a midwife to help a mother give birth. It's righteous for a farmer to sell raw milk to his neighbor. It's righteous for me to drive on the roadways. I should not be punished. No one should be punished for those righteous actions. If Decker just takes the next step, if these guys just take the next step, we are right into theonomic territory. What does the law word of God authorize the civil government to do? We have to take that step. I'm concerned, though, based on comments like Gunden's, I'm concerned that there's this emotional resistance to take that step and acknowledge that the theonomists are right about anything. Because for so long, this culture has been fostered by people like Dr. Godfrey and others, that the theonomists are they're kooks and they're nuts, and they teach that you shouldn't need a driver's license and think through it and be consistent with your application. And I think you'll see the beauty of God's law word and the limits it places on the civil government. I do want to place one more clip. This is from Gunden. So here he's still not getting it. Maybe he's moved forward a little bit, but he's still not. He's almost right, but he's not right. Listen to what Gunden says the government's role is.
Yeah, on this issue of gun control in New Mexico, it was just a couple months ago. It wasn't a couple of years ago.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah. But even taking their constitution as a state out of it, if the civil magistrate has a duty to protect its citizens, I don't see how you can see it anything other than tyrannical than to deprive citizens of the ability to protect themselves. Right. And I know a lot of brothers and sisters from different countries will look at America and say, boy, you guys are just nuts with your Second Amendment. But I really do think that is the case. And so I think it was not only constitutionally right for the sheriffs, but I think even according to the law of God, it was right for them to not enforce that tyrannical law in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Okay, again, he's almost right. It was a tyrannical law saying you're not allowed to have weapons or whatever in New Mexico, I guess. But did you hear what he said? The government's duty is to protect us. That is wrong. That is wrong. And again, if, Pastor Gunden, if you had been or after 2020 even started studying, the theonomists and the work that they've done in applying God's law word to the civil sphere, I don't think you'd say something like that. Or maybe it'd be a slip of the tongue, but I don't think that was a slip of the tongue. He says the government is there to protect us. And the government is not there to protect us. The government's role, and this is where Decker hit the nail on the head, just repeating what has been taught for, generations, that the civil government, it's in the Bible, the civil government is there to punish evildoers. That is different than protecting the righteous. I'm responsible to protect myself. That means I'm responsible to make my, health choices. I'm responsible to, wear a seatbelt. I'm responsible to protect myself. If I harm myself, that's on me. If I harm someone else because of my actions, well, now I'll be liable and I'll be punished for my actions. But the civil government does not exist to protect us. If that's the way you view civil government, Gunden's setting himself up again for just another, 2020 type thing where the government says, well, our job is to protect you. So we're going to say you're not allowed to have church because all these illegal immigrants have come in and there's terrorists among them and everybody has to lock down in their houses until we find, these bioterrorists who are spreading all this stuff. Like, it could be anything. And if you believe the government's job is to protect us, then you have given them carte blanche to really do whatever is necessary and proper to protect people. And that's not their job. I want to read Rushdoony again, writing in the 1970s. This is not new. He talks about when the law is positive in function, quote, the state has total jurisdiction to compel the total health of the people. He goes on to say, okay, if the government is not limited to enforcing God's law, but rather has free reign to apply any law they want in order to protect people, we're going to have some serious tyranny. Rushdoony continues, because humanistic law is unlimited, the state is unlimited. It becomes the business of the state not to control evil, but to control men. Basic to every totalitarian regime is a positive concept of the function of the law. And again, those of us who had read stuff like that, who had been thinking about it, 2020 comes along. Oh, this is obvious. The government is going to use their unlimited man-made lawmaking ability, humanistic law, in order to, under the auspice of protecting us, in order to tyrannize us. Again, we had that category. Why did the government say raw milk couldn't be sold in Delaware? Oh, it's to protect me. Why aren't midwives allowed to help women give birth? Oh, to protect them, because these midwives might not be qualified. As if we can't make that decision as parents for who we want to help deliver our child. So again, Gunden's so close, but yet in one sense still so far. And this is my concern. If you just, okay, we're just going to patch up, we found a little dent in our vehicle. We're going to patch it up and now we're going to be good to go. I want to know why you had that dent there. Maybe it's because your brakes were cut and you went out one time and you slammed into a wall. To just say, all right, well, we figured out COVID-19, we're good to go, without addressing the underlying problem that put you in that position, you're not making much progress. And when Gunden says things like that, like no one was thinking about this, the government's there to protect us, it's very concerning for me. So I hope that Timothy Decker, and I'm going to reach out to him and try to see if he'll be willing to come on and discuss this, and even perhaps Graham Gunden. I hope that they'd be willing to say, hey, you know what, we need to step back completely and say we were totally wrong, not just about COVID-19, but even about a lot of the things the theonomists were saying. And I think we need to talk about it. And I think those would be some steps in the right direction. But just to simply say, hey, we got this wrong. No one was thinking about it, so it can't really be blamed. That's kind of the mindset. Nobody was thinking about this. We were all blindsided. That is not true. And the fact that you think that is very, very concerning. So that's it for today. Stay tuned. We're going to have more episodes coming up. We will address different angles of this with some of the other co-hosts on the show here. I encourage you to read the works of Bahnsen, Rushdoony. A lot of them are very lengthy. Just read some of their shorter works. Start thinking about this. Check out Luke Saint's book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy. Check out my book, 7 Status Sins, where questions like this are dealt with. People have been talking about them for decades. And so Graham Gunden is wrong. This is not a new thing. And the fact that we think it is really concerns me. So I hope that the Church of Jesus Christ can not just move forward from 2020 and be like, all right, we learned a couple things. I hope they can take stock and we can have a real reformation here as it relates to the application of the law word of God to every sphere of life. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Lancaster Patriot Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, go to patreon.com/the Lancaster Patriot. And for more information, go to thelancasterpatriot.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, remember that Christ, not man, is king. So long.